Welcome back to Insight as we examine the future for the United Nations. One man who knows all about the inner workings of the organization is Sir Jeremy Greenstock. He was the UK's representative to the UN for 5 years, including during the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And I went to speak to him. Do you think in general the UN has been an effective organization?
Yes, immensely, in the sense that since 1945 there have been very few wars between states at the top level of a global nature or a continental nature. There have been many local, regional conflicts, and they've been extremely nasty. Syria is an example of one now. But the UN has been very successful in getting people talking before they shoot. It also is the repository of all the norms and principles of international behaviour. Never before in a long period of peace has there been such a set of principles to follow, with mechanisms for making sure that those norms are implemented. Now, the implementation power of the UN has not been as strong as we might have liked, but what nation states agree on is taken forward at the UN, and they don't always agree on strong implementation measures. But the UN has been extremely effective in those big political areas, as well as, of course, in the work of its funds, agencies and programmes, which have been looking after refugees and children and health and many other things around the world.
The lack of implementation, though, I mean, that leads us to things like the Security Council. Some people say that that is now, the structure is crippling the UN to carry out what intervention in places like Syria.
I don't actually think it's the structure. If you reform the UN, which I don't think is going to be possible, or the Security Council, and had a larger Security Council of 24 or 30 or whatever, it wouldn't prevent nation states falling out over particular measures to enforce international law. It's the disagreement between big states over enforcement that has caused the most difficulty.
Where do you think the major area of success has been, from your perspective, on success that the United Nations has had worldwide?
Well, I think Africa has been an enormous centre of troubles in certain areas, but the Security Council's work on Africa, while I was there, 2/3 of the Security Council's work was on Africa, has gradually worked the continent towards a new sense of opportunity if the standard of governance locally in the capitals is strong enough to introduce new ways to progressing the economy, getting business going, getting investment coming in. It's beginning to turn away from conflict and towards the economic imperative that is most important in the 21st century. The UN has helped with that. The UN's work in allowing new states to form when there was an agreement to do so. East Timor was a great success for the Security Council. The splitting of the Sudans has been more troublesome, but at least they've worked out where their identities want to reside on territory and have got something to work on. Dealing with Yugoslavia was much more difficult, but gradually we brought peace to Yugoslavia. And although there are many arguments still to be had within the 6 states that emerged from Yugoslavia, the UN has helped that to happen. Indeed, settling the breakup of the Soviet Union into 15 different states was helped by the UN. President Putin has got some afterthoughts about that, but the norms that the UN has laid out for those sorts of processes, for changing borders, have been actually quite a strong element of positive progress.
Surely the Rwanda genocide was one of the worst black eyes the UN has ever had in terms of not taking action to stop a genocide.
And Rwanda, and in the same year, Srebrenica in Bosnia was, a wake-up call in 1994 for the United Nations. Since then, I think the UN has got its act together rather better.
Were lessons learned on Rwanda?
I think there were. I think Iraq was too big an issue for the UN to handle in 2003, and the UK and the US went together on that against the wishes of the majority of the UN. So you can find good examples, you can find bad examples, and Rwanda was certainly a bad moment, and we must remember it. But Rwanda, ever since, under President Kagame, has made gradual progress towards stability and economic regeneration.
You mentioned Iraq. I mean, the whole build-up to the 2003 invasion was built on a large part on the UN inspection process, on UN reports, and then eventually they were used by the American and the British government as a basis for invasion, in addition to their own intelligence.
The basic point on Iraq was that the American superpower was too impatient to let the UN handle the issue against the background of 9/11. You've got to connect Iraq with 9/11. It released the potential for the American government, including the Congress, to regard Iraq as an enemy so dangerous that it had to be dealt with before there was another 9/11. I think, and I've always thought that that was exaggerated, but neither President George W. Bush nor Prime Minister Blair felt that they could afford the risk of another 9/11 being planned and enacted against them. So that overrode the instincts of the UN that the position of Saddam at that moment did not deserve a war as large as the Iraq invasion. So it was American impatience to deal with a threat that actually overrode the UN, and the UN couldn't do anything about it. We just had to agree to disagree.
Some say one of the biggest faults of the United Nations has been its inability to act in terms of dealing with terrorism, which is a worldwide problem, and even defining the word terrorism.
Well, you're talking about the UN as though it was a separate power. The UN is its member states in the political arena. It's member states who have many definitions of terrorism and haven't agreed on one of them. It's member states who have disagreed on the way to deal with terrorism in a particular area. You know, I think it needs to be recognised that terrorism begins at home. Terrorism starts with a group thinking it wants to get rid of a particular government for a particular reason. And it then begins to use a very old method of assassinating people, of blowing people up, of creating terror to get other people involved to create a mess in the region where they want change. Al-Qaeda was focused on change of regime in Saudi Arabia. ISIS is focused on creating ungoverned space in the Middle East so that they can set up a caliphate. It's very localized until its methods get globalized. Now, the UN has set down norms for the international behavior and for reducing conflict at the regional or the global level, but the UN is not empowered to deal with the local sores that fester into terrorism within a state. And that's been the problem.
Would you see the change of leadership in terms of the Secretary General as having that much influence over the direction of the United Nations?
The Secretary General's job has remained the same. It's been done in different styles in different eras by different people. Ban Ki-moon has been very assiduous on some of the detail of environmental issues, of gender issues, peace and security issues in Africa, particularly Sudan, where he hasn't necessarily succeeded. I think he has shown less of the kind of Kofi Annan charisma for symbolizing the moral authority of the UN. I hope that Antonio Guterres, as the next Secretary General, will bring those two great qualities together of hard work for peace and for development, together with a moral authority that stands up against member states who are contravening international law. That's what we need from the Secretary General. I don't think that the big powers have yet understood the degree of compromise that's going to be necessary to stop a great global war breaking out in the next 20 or 30 years. That's what I want the Secretary General to focus on above all.
On the environment, President-elect Trump has talked about the U.S. pulling away from the Paris Accords. Does that concern you?
Let's not take too many assumptions out of what President-elect Trump is saying. Let's see what he does. It looks as though he will withdraw from American activity in the Trans-Pacific trade agreement. That partnership will be weaker without the Americans in it. He wants to do it the first day he comes into office. I don't think he can break that promise. I think he will think for rather longer about the Paris Agreement. There's no point in withdrawing from it until you see what it can potentially achieve. I'm not sure he's yet looked at that. There does need to be, though, the next level of agreement on some quite hard decisions on spending money on climate change prevention. And that has not yet been decided by all the member states together. The Paris Agreement is only halfway there.
You talk about the next war possible seriously, do you believe in the next 20 to 30 years?
Yes, historically, all the indications are that we are heading for it because competition usually turns into conflict, and every long period of peace, by definition in history, has ended in a big war. So we have to do something unprecedented in history, completely unprecedented, to make that long period of peace last indefinitely. I don't think those unprecedented actions are yet being prepared for by big powers. Now, one thing we have that's unprecedented is the existence of the United Nations, both its set of norms and principles and its very important forum for discussing these things. So we've got one thing to help us. The next thing that is necessary is leadership that understands that an escalation of competition into conflict absolutely has to be avoided. Otherwise, I give it no more than 100 years after the end of the Second World War, I give it to 2045 for us to find some way of avoiding the next global war. Unless a greater element of compromise and sacrifice is built into the relationships between big powers, I think we are heading for war.
So after 72 years of work, the next 12 months could be critical for the United Nations. Its new leader has called for a year of peace, but his 5-year term is likely to be defined by the UN's response to one war, the conflict in Syria. That's all for now. I'm Dana Lewis, and that was Inside.